Beneath the marble grandeur of the Roman Empire, the forums, aqueducts, and triumphal arches there pulsed a darker heart. Rome was not built solely on law and engineering. It was sustained by blood, fear, and spectacle. In its arenas and circuses, cruelty became ceremony, death became entertainment, and suffering was sculpted into a tool of control. Emperors fed the masses not only bread, but also the agony of men, women, and beasts, turning execution into theater and punishment into ritual. Here, life and death were public property decided by cheers, wagers, and imperial whims. From staged mythological killings to executions designed as political messages, Rome's spectacles were as deliberate as they were barbaric, reflecting a society that saw no contradiction between civilization and savagery. What happened in those arenas was not madness, it was policy, woven into the empire's identity and carved into its very idea of power. To understand how the Roman world turned cruelty into entertainment, we must begin long before the Colosseum's arches loomed over the city. The roots of Roman spectacle stretched deep into the Republic, into a society that believed violence public, controlled, and ritualized was an essential part of governance. It was not simply a distraction for the masses. It was a statement of who held power and how that power would be enforced. Public death served a dual purpose. It punished the condemned and educated the living. The earliest spectacles were not staged for amusement, but for religious duty. Rome's first gladiatorial contests, known as munera, were funerary rites, bloody offerings to honor the dead and appease the gods of the underworld. According to Livy, one of the earliest recorded munera took place in 264 BCE, when the sons of Junius Brutus Pera staged a combat between three pairs of gladiators to commemorate their father's death. These were not games in the modern sense. They were sacrifices, a public negotiation with mortality. Death in the arena was not cruelty, it was cosmic balance. But by the late Republic, the purpose had shifted. The munera became political instruments. Ambitious men, Julius Caesar among them, discovered that spectacles could buy public favor far more effectively than speeches or reforms. In 65 BCE, Caesar staged elaborate games featuring hundreds of gladiators and exotic animals. It was a demonstration of wealth, control, and imperial reach, a calculated act to seduce the Roman crowd and secure political advancement. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, would become the currency of Roman politics, and the arena its most potent bank. The public appetite for violence grew insatiable. By the 1st century BCE, executions had evolved into elaborate performances staged in the Forum Boarium, or the Circus Maximus. Criminals were no longer merely beheaded or crucified. They were burned alive, torn apart by beasts, or forced to fight until death. These punishments, known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, were designed as spectacles of deterrence, visual sermons about the consequences of disobedience. They were often staged during festivals, when the maximum number of citizens could witness them, their horror magnified by the presence of music, ritual chants, and theatrical staging. The imperial period took these practices to unprecedented extremes. Augustus institutionalized the games as instruments of statecraft, using them to project imperial authority. The Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian built the Colosseum not just as a gift to the people, but as a stage for empire's ideological performance. Every event, from gladiatorial duels to naval battles flooded into the arena's basin, told a story. Rome's power was absolute, its reach global, its violence divinely sanctioned. To sit in the stands was to witness the empire reenacting its own mythology, and to understand one's place within it. The ritualization of death also served a deeply psychological function. Spectacles transformed punishment into communal experience, turning fear into entertainment and suffering into shared identity. When a condemned man was devoured by lions or a rebel crucified before thousands, the message was unmistakable. Rome's enemies would not merely die, they would die visibly, humiliatingly, and in ways that etched terror into memory. This public nature of punishment, as Seneca observed, taught obedience more powerfully than law. Nor was this violence indiscriminate. It was carefully categorized. matched to the crime, the social status of the condemned, and the message the state sought to send. Slaves might be burned or dismembered as examples to others. Rebels and traitors could be executed as mythological villains, their deaths staged to dramatize their betrayal. Even executions of foreign prisoners were often tailored to maximize symbolic value, paraded as conquered kings, stripped and humiliated before their deaths, reinforcing the narrative of Roman superiority. Over time, this brutal system became self-sustaining. Public expectation demanded ever greater spectacles. The people who once watched executions as grim instruction now demanded innovation, novelty, and excess. Emperors obliged. Nero staged theatrical punishments in which condemned criminals played mythic figures, Icarus hurled from scaffolding, Orpheus torn apart by animals, their deaths choreographed as part of elaborate performances. Under Domitian, executions became pre-show entertainment before the main gladiatorial events, ensuring that blood spilled in the arena before the crowd even took its seats. Yet beneath the cruelty was calculation. The spectacle was never just about death. It was about control. It was a language the empire spoke fluently, one written in blood, applause, and fear. To watch was to participate, to internalize the lesson that Rome could end life as easily as it granted it. And for the state, that was the ultimate point. Public violence was not an aberration. It was a pillar of Roman identity, a ritual through which power was performed, justified, and made eternal. By the time the Colosseum's inaugural games opened in 80 CE, 100 days of slaughter involving thousands of men and beasts, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a funerary rite had become a cornerstone of imperial culture, an institution woven into Rome's civic, political, and religious life. The arena was no longer just a place of death. It was a theater of empire, a mirror reflecting the brutal soul of a civilization that believed order was born not from mercy, but from spectacle. Among all the spectacles staged beneath the Roman sun, few were as grotesquely symbolic or as deliberately inhumane as damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. This was more than an execution method. It was a performance designed to erase a human being's dignity, to strip them of agency, and to turn their death into a public reaffirmation of imperial power. It was punishment as theater, law as spectacle, and it became one of the most defining rituals of Roman public life. The origins of damnatio ad bestias lie in the Republic, but it was under the Empire that it matured into a form of mass entertainment. Initially reserved for enemies of the state, rebels, deserters, and captured foreign leaders, it soon expanded to include criminals, slaves, Christians, and anyone the authorities deemed subversive. By the 1st century CE, it had become a staple of festivals and public holidays, woven into the schedule of games and celebrations. The arena became both courtroom and stage, where the guilty were condemned not just to die, but to die spectacularly. The process was ritualized from the start. Prisoners were paraded before the crowd, often naked or in rags, their crimes read aloud by a herald. The atmosphere was theatrical, almost ceremonial. Vendors sold food and wine. Senators and magistrates watched from marble seats, and musicians played as the condemned were led into the sand. What followed was a scene that hovered between the religious and the barbaric. The gates of the animal cages would be raised, and the beasts, lions, leopards, bears, and wolves released into the arena. These animals were not ordinary creatures. They were carefully selected for maximum dramatic effect. Some were starved beforehand to heighten their aggression. Others were brought from the farthest edges of the empire, Africa, Persia, even India, a living display of Rome's reach and dominance. Their presence alone was propaganda, a demonstration that Rome not only conquered peoples, but controlled nature itself. As Pliny the Elder wrote, "There is no beast so wild that it cannot be made to serve the glory of Rome." The condemned rarely stood a chance. Unarmed and terrified, they were mauled, dismembered, and devoured as the audience cheered. The violence was not hidden or sanitized. It was prolonged and staged to maximize horror. Sometimes, a prisoner might be tied to a stake, unable to flee as the animals circled and tore at their flesh. In other cases, they were forced to fight back with rudimentary weapons, a cruel illusion of agency that only delayed the inevitable. The spectacle was designed to reduce them to prey, a living metaphor for rebellion, crushed beneath imperial power. For Christians, damnatio ad bestias became both punishment and message. During Nero's reign, many were condemned for refusing to worship the emperor or the state gods. Tacitus describes how they were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or smeared with pitch and set alight to illuminate the games. To the Roman authorities, their suffering was a warning. The state's power was absolute, and defiance, even spiritual defiance, would end in blood and humiliation. Yet for early Christians, these executions became acts of martyrdom, their stories spreading far beyond the arena walls and shaping the narrative of faith under persecution. There were variations designed for even greater theatrical impact. Sometimes condemned prisoners were matched against exotic predators in staged hunts, forced to run and hide while beasts tracked them down. Other times, groups of criminals were released together, turning the execution into a grotesque parody of military combat. The most elaborate displays reenacted mythological scenes, victims playing the roles of figures like Actaeon or Androcles, their scripted deaths mirroring the fates of their mythic counterparts. These performances blurred the line between punishment and performance so thoroughly that audiences often forgot they were watching real people die. The logistics of such spectacles were immense. Thousands of animals were captured, transported, and maintained at enormous expense. Emperors like Titus and Trajan imported entire menageries for single events, sometimes slaughtering thousands of animals over the course of a festival. The Venetianes staged hunts and animal combats often preceded or accompanied damnatio ad bestias, turning the entire day into a celebration of blood. These events were so central to Roman civic life that emperors were judged by their generosity in staging them. A ruler who provided plentiful beasts and gruesome spectacles was praised as magnanimous. One who economized risked appearing weak. The psychological function of damnatio ad bestias was as significant as its entertainment value. To the watching crowd, the condemned were not just criminals, they were symbols of disorder, enemies of the state, embodiments of everything that threatened Roman order. Their destruction reaffirmed the hierarchy that sustained the empire. The spectacle taught obedience not through law, but through horror. It reminded every slave, every provincial, every citizen of the unbridgeable gap between Rome's power and their own fragility. Not all reactions were enthusiastic. Philosophers like Seneca condemned the practice, calling it murder disguised as justice, and lamenting the moral corrosion it inflicted on spectators. Yet his words were whispers against the roar of the crowd. By the height of the empire, damnatio ad bestias had become too entrenched to question a tradition that defined what it meant to be Roman as much as the toga or the triumph. In the end, this form of execution was not about justice, nor even about vengeance. It was about visibility. A beheading in a prison cell or a quiet exile could not serve the empire's needs. Rome wanted its power seen, its enemies humiliated, and its dominance made manifest. And so the condemned were thrown to the beasts, their suffering offered as a spectacle, their deaths as public proof that no defiance could go unpunished. In that sand-stained arena, the empire's ideology was laid bare. Rome ruled not just through law and legions, but through terror, carved into flesh beneath a cheering sky. Of all the punishments devised by the Roman state, none was more deliberately degrading, more protracted, or more symbolically loaded than crucifixion. It was not simply an execution. It was a ritual humiliation, a public dissection of a human life, and a carefully staged performance designed to terrify anyone who might challenge imperial authority. For centuries, the cross stood as Rome's ultimate statement, that defiance would not only be crushed, but would be broken slowly, visibly, and without dignity, under the gaze of the world. The origins of crucifixion predate Rome, practiced by the Persians and Carthaginians, but it was the Romans who perfected it, refining the technique. into something both functional and theatrical. They called it supplicium servile, the slave's punishment, and its very name revealed its purpose. It was reserved for those without honor, slaves, rebels, pirates, and foreigners. Roman citizens were almost never crucified, for the penalty was considered too degrading for those with legal status. Its power lay precisely in that degradation, in its ability to reduce a human being to a spectacle of suffering. The process began long before the cross was raised. Condemned men and women were paraded through the streets, stripped of clothing, scourged with whips tipped in bone or metal, and forced to carry the patibulum, the heavy crossbeam, through jeering crowds. This procession, the Via Dolorosa of the condemned, was itself part of the punishment. Every blow, every insult, every stumble served to erase their humanity and turn them into objects of scorn. The journey ended not at a private place of execution, but at a public crossroads, hill or city gate, a deliberate choice to ensure maximum visibility. The cross itself was a calculated instrument of suffering. Victims were affixed in various ways, sometimes tied with ropes, often nailed through wrists and ankles. The vertical beam, the stipes, was often left standing in permanent execution sites, while the horizontal patibulum was attached as needed. Once raised, the condemned might linger for hours or even days. Death came not from blood loss, but from exhaustion, dehydration, or asphyxiation, as the victim's body sagged and the lungs struggled for air. The slow, incremental nature of this death was precisely the point. It was not enough for the condemned to die, they had to suffer, visibly and publicly, as a living warning. The spectacle was meticulously orchestrated. Soldiers guarded the site, not just to prevent rescue, but to manage the performance, to prolong the agony, to control the crowd, to stage the narrative. Victims were often left exposed for days after death, their bodies rotting in the sun, picked apart by birds, their bones a grim reminder to anyone passing by. Cicero, no stranger to Rome's harshest punishments, described crucifixion as crudelissimum taeterimumque supplicium, the most cruel and disgusting penalty. Its cruelty was not an accident. It was the very reason the punishment existed. Crucifixion was used not only for individual crimes, but also as a tool of mass terror. When Spartacus's slave revolt was crushed in 71 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way, a 120-mile stretch lined with dying men, each one a warning to the millions who traveled the road. In Judea, rebellious towns saw entire populations nailed to crosses after uprisings. Their deaths turned into gruesome public exhibitions. The message was clear. Rome's power was not confined to the battlefield. It extended into the very flesh of those who opposed it. Sometimes the cross served a theatrical purpose beyond punishment. Victims were dressed as mythological villains or enemies of the gods, their suffering staged as a kind of morality play. In one notorious case recorded by Seneca, a prisoner was crucified upside down to increase his agony. His slow, disoriented death turned into a form of macabre entertainment. Another account describes crucifixions timed with public festivals, where the dying formed part of the spectacle, their gasps and cries woven into the rhythm of the celebrations. The psychological effect was profound. To witness a crucifixion was to confront the empire's unchallengeable authority. It was a lesson carved into the skyline, a demonstration that disobedience would not only fail, but would be erased from the earth with maximum humiliation. Even those not condemned were shaped by it. Merchants, travelers, and slaves passing by the crosses internalized the message. Rome's reach was absolute, its patience finite, its vengeance total. The early Christians, whose founder was executed by this very method, understood the cross as both terror and paradox. For them it was the ultimate symbol of imperial cruelty, and eventually, through inversion, of redemption. But long before it was sanctified by faith, it was feared as a device of empire, a reminder that the state could not only take life, but make death itself a public ritual of domination. Not all Romans embraced the practice. Philosophers and jurists debated its morality, and some emperors, notably Constantine in the 4th century CE, eventually banned crucifixion as unworthy of a civilized empire. But by then, its legacy was carved deep into the Roman psyche. For nearly a millennium, the cross had been Rome's stage and symbol of vertical proclamation of the state's power over the body, the will, and the soul. Crucifixion was more than a punishment. It was a performance, a drama staged before the eyes of the people, a visual sermon on the consequences of defiance. It turned suffering into law, death into spectacle, and the human body into a warning post for the empire. In the shadow of the cross, obedience was not just demanded, it was burned into memory, nailed into history, and displayed on the skyline of a civilization that believed power was strongest when it was seen. By the height of the empire, Roman public spectacles had evolved far beyond punishment. Death itself was no longer merely a sentence, it was a script. Condemned men and women, stripped of rights and reduced to instruments of state theater, were forced to reenact myths on the arena floor, their real suffering woven into stories of gods, heroes, and monsters. In this grotesque fusion of drama and execution, Rome turned mythology, the cultural foundation of its identity, into a tool of domination. The result was a kind of state-sponsored theater where the line between performance and reality dissolved in blood. The origins of these performances lay in a distinctly Roman obsession. The idea that power should be displayed, not merely exercised. By reenacting myths in which mortals were punished for hubris or defiance, the state cast itself as divine arbiter and cast the condemned as villains in cosmic narratives. It was not enough to kill the condemned, had to mean something. Their deaths became allegories of rebellion, crushed, order restored, and imperial authority sanctified. One of the earliest recorded examples comes from the reign of Emperor Nero, whose love of theater and spectacle blurred the boundaries between performance and governance. During his games, criminals were dressed as figures from classical myths, Orpheus, Hercules, Daedalus, and executed in ways that mimicked their legendary fates. The condemned playing Orpheus, for instance, was mauled by wild animals as he sang, mirroring the mythic musician's death at the hands of Thracian women. These spectacles were more than grotesque entertainments. They were statements of power, transforming execution into allegory, and reinforcing the state's narrative that defiance, like mythic hubris, always ended in ruin. Theatrical death became more elaborate under the Flavian emperors. Titus and Domitian staged entire mythological plays during the opening games of the Colosseum, using condemned criminals as living props. One infamous spectacle reenacted the story of Dirce, who in myth was tied to a bull and dragged to death for her cruelty. A condemned woman, cast as Dirce, was bound to the horns of a wild bull before a roaring audience and torn apart in the sand, her agony both punishment and performance. Another condemned man was forced into the role of Icarus and thrown from a tall structure in the arena, his broken body symbolizing the folly of overreaching ambition. Some of the most notorious spectacles involved recreations of scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, a poetic compendium of transformation and punishment. Victims were burned alive to mimic Hercules' fiery death on Mount Oeta, dismembered like Pentheus for mocking Dionysus, or devoured by animals in reenactments of Actaeon's fate. In each case, the mythological parallel was deliberate. The condemned were cast not merely as criminals, but as archetypes of disobedience, their punishments transformed into cautionary tales. These spectacles were meticulously staged for theatrical effect. Elaborate sets were built inside the arena, artificial mountains, wooden temples, even mechanical devices that released fire or water to simulate natural disasters. Costumes were prepared, props constructed, and music composed to heighten the drama. The audience was not simply watching an execution, they were witnessing a story unfold, a story in which the empire itself played the role of the gods. The message was clear. Just as divine justice punished hubris in myth, imperial justice would crush rebellion in reality. The condemned, of course, had no choice in the matter. Once sentenced, they were stripped of all legal protections and declared noxii, guilty ones, whose lives no longer belonged to them. They were forced to memorize lines, don costumes, and perform rehearsed gestures, often without knowing the manner of their death until the final moment. Many were slaves or prisoners of war, but some were Roman citizens stripped of their rights for treason or sacrilege. Their humiliation was as integral to the spectacle as their death itself. The psychological impact of these mythological executions was immense. They blurred the boundaries between fiction and reality, divine and imperial, morality and law. For the spectators, watching a condemned man die, as Prometheus chained and torn apart by birds, was not just entertainment. It was a reinforcement of cultural values, a demonstration that those who defied order would meet the same fate as the arrogant figures of legend. It also provided an emotional catharsis. Audiences could revel in the triumph of justice while distancing themselves from the brutality of the act, telling themselves that the condemned were not victims, but characters fulfilling a cosmic destiny. Not everyone approved. Seneca, disgusted by the increasing theatricalization of executions, warned that such spectacles teach cruelty as pleasure. Yet emperors ignored such criticisms. The popularity of mythological executions only grew, their blend of drama and death satisfying the Roman hunger for spectacle in ways that simple punishment could not. They also served a political function, diverting public attention from imperial misrule and channeling societal frustrations into ritualized displays of vengeance. By the 2nd century CE, this macabre tradition had become an institution. At festivals, the schedule of events often included a morning of executions, a midday round of gladiatorial combat, and an afternoon of mythological reenactments. The condemned died not as themselves, but as Aetes, Marsyas, or Sisyphus, their final moments, scripted centuries before their births. Even in death, they were denied individuality. They became symbols, props in a larger story about Rome's divine right to rule and its unassailable authority. It was perhaps the most chilling transformation of all. In the Roman world, death had always been a tool of power, but now it was also art, narrative, and entertainment. The condemned were no longer just examples. They were actors in a theater of terror, their suffering woven into the very myths that defined Roman identity. The message was unmistakable. To oppose the empire was not just to risk death, it was to become part of a story written by the state itself, a story in which the end was always the same. If gladiators and beasts represented the savage intimacy of Roman spectacle, the Naumachia staged naval battles fought to the death embodied its scale. No other entertainment in the ancient world combined such staggering logistics, colossal expense, and ruthless disregard for human life. These were not symbolic reenactments of war. They were war itself orchestrated, contained, and displayed as public theater, where thousands of men fought and died in artificial seas for the amusement of the Roman crowd. The first recorded Naumachia was staged in 46 BCE by Julius Caesar to celebrate his quadruple triumph. On a specially constructed basin near the Tiber, he flooded an area large enough to accommodate actual warships and filled it with thousands of prisoners of war and condemned criminals. These men, stripped of armor and experience, were forced to reenact a naval battle between Tyrian and Egyptian fleets. Most had never touched an oar or a blade before that day. Yet, they were sent to slaughter one another. Under the gaze of tens of thousands, their deaths transformed into imperial entertainment. The spectacle was a success beyond measure. Caesar's innovation stunned Rome and established a new expectation that imperial celebrations must exceed anything seen before. Successors took the lesson to heart. Augustus, seeking to cement his legitimacy after decades of civil war, staged an even grander Naumachia in 2 BCE to mark the dedication of the temple of Mars Ultor. He excavated a basin nearly 1,800 feet long and 1,200 feet wide, filled it with water from the Tiber, and deployed 3,000 combatants and 30 ships. The crowd, seated on temporary wooden stands, roared as men fought and drowned, before them a living metaphor for the emperor's dominion over chaos. But the most notorious of all Naumachii were those staged under the Flavian emperors. When the Colosseum was inaugurated in 80 CE, Titus ordered the arena flooded for mock sea battles involving hundreds of condemned men and specially constructed ships. According to Suetonius, the spectacle included not just combat, but elaborate choreography, ships crashing, fires erupting, and actors portraying legendary naval commanders. These displays were not only entertainment, they were political theater. They reminded the people that Rome's power extended beyond land, that its fleets ruled the seas just as its legions ruled the continents. The logistics of these spectacles were staggering. Engineers built complex drainage systems, water channels, and mechanical gates to flood and empty arenas. Wooden ships were constructed, often to scale, and fitted with rams and sails. Animals were sometimes included crocodiles, dolphins, or trained seals to enhance the spectacle's exoticism. Combatants, most of them prisoners or slaves, were armed with real weapons, but often given no training, ensuring a chaotic and bloody struggle. Many died before even reaching the enemy, drowning beneath overturned vessels, crushed by collapsing structures, or swept under by rushing water. The participants knew their fate. Accounts describe the condemned greeting the emperor with the infamous salute, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar. We who are about to die salute you. Whether or not this phrase was regularly spoken is debated by historians, but its presence in the record captures the essence of the spectacle. It was an execution disguised as a pageant, a massacre dressed in the trappings of history and glory. The battles themselves were carefully scripted, often reenacting famous conflicts from Rome's past. Some depicted Roman victories over Carthage or Greece, reinforcing the narrative of imperial destiny. Others dramatized legendary clashes from Homeric epics or mythic wars, blending history and legend into one grand narrative of Roman supremacy. These were not mere shows of violence, they were state propaganda, reinforcing Rome's historical mission as conqueror and civilizer. The scale of slaughter was immense. Cassius Dio records that during one Nomachia under Emperor Claudius, staged on Lake Fucinus in 52 CE, over 19,000 men were forced into battle. They fought on rafts and ships while spectators, including the emperor himself, watched from temporary grandstands built along the shore. Many drowned in the cold, churning water, unable to swim under the weight of their armor. When the battle ended, the survivors were often executed on the spot. Their labor and their lives existed solely for that day's entertainment. These spectacles served purposes beyond amusement. They were powerful displays of imperial control, not just over men and armies, but over nature itself. To command water, to flood an arena, to choreograph entire fleets within a man-made lake, was to demonstrate a power that seemed godlike. Emperors used Nomachii to associate themselves with Neptune and Mars, presenting themselves as masters of both sea and war. The symbolism was unmistakable. Rome could recreate the forces of nature and history itself for the pleasure of its people. For the crowd, the appeal was both visceral and psychological. They witnessed the scale of empire rendered tangible, the reach of its armies, the depth of its resources, the sheer expendability of human life in service of spectacle. Yet beneath the awe was a darker lesson, that the empire's subjects, whether barbarian captives or condemned criminals, existed at the mercy of imperial will. Their deaths were not merely permitted, they were orchestrated, aestheticized, and applauded. Critics existed, as always. Seneca and other Stoic philosophers condemned Naumachii as monstrous excesses that degraded both participants and spectators. Even some emperors balked at the costs, financial and moral. But the people's appetite was insatiable, and emperors, eager for popularity, continued to indulge it. The Naumachia became one of the most potent symbols of Rome's power, not in its triumphs abroad, but in its ability to stage those triumphs anew at home, at whatever cost in human life. In the end, Naumachii revealed a truth as brutal as it was deliberate, that in Rome, war itself had become entertainment, and death, even on a massive scale, was simply another form of imperial performance. The empire's mastery over men, nature, and memory was complete. It could recreate oceans in the heart of the city. It could summon armies from its prisons. And it could turn all of it into theater, a spectacle that reminded every Roman, from senator to slave, of the cost of power and the price of defiance. In ancient Rome, death was not confined to the margins of society. It was not hidden in prisons, whispered in courts, or sealed away from public life. It was center stage, woven into the calendar, paired with music and feasting. and presented as a communal ritual. Executions were not only punishments, they were festivities, deliberately scheduled to coincide with religious holidays, military victories, and imperial anniversaries. They were moments when the state turned killing into celebration, and when the Roman people learned to cheer as human beings were broken before their eyes. The pairing of execution and festivity began with the Republic's earliest spectacles. Festivals like the Ludi Romani and Ludi Plebe, originally held to honor Jupiter and other gods, featured athletic contests, theatrical performances, and increasingly public punishments. What began as solemn rituals of purification evolved into staged demonstrations of state power. Executions were offered not just to appease divine wrath, but to reaffirm order at moments of civic pride. They reminded the populace that the prosperity they celebrated rested on the empire's capacity to crush opposition without hesitation. By the imperial era, this practice had become a cornerstone of Roman political culture. Major public holidays, the emperor's birthday, the dedication of temples, victories over foreign enemies were often marked by a day of games, dies ludi, which always included executions. The condemned were displayed in the morning, before the gladiatorial combats and animal hunts began. They were the opening act, a grim prelude that whetted the crowd's appetite for the bloodier entertainments to come. Suetonius records that during Claudius's reign, prisoners were paraded through the Circus Maximus wearing placards describing their crimes, their humiliation part of the festival's entertainment value. The scenes that followed were as theatrical as they were brutal. Victims were flogged, burned alive, or torn apart by animals in front of roaring crowds. Some were mutilated hands chopped off, eyes gouged before being executed, their suffering prolonged to keep the audience engaged. Others were subjected to elaborate tortures meant to serve as moral lessons. Parricides, those who killed their own parents, were sewn into sacks with snakes, dogs, and monkeys, and thrown into the Tiber in a punishment known as poena culae. Traitors were sometimes suspended from poles and beaten to death slowly over hours. Each method carried a message, and the timing of these executions during festivals ensured that the message reached the widest possible audience. The state understood that spectacle was more powerful when paired with celebration. A holiday crowd was larger, more receptive, and more emotionally engaged. Amid the music, parades, and public feasts, executions felt less like acts of state violence and more like communal rituals, shared experiences that bound the people to the empire's laws and its emperor's will. This blending of joy and cruelty served a deeper psychological purpose. It normalized violence as part of civic life. Death was no longer something to be feared or hidden. It was entertainment, pedagogy, even tradition. The festivals also provided emperors with opportunities to display mercy or its denial as acts of political theater. Sometimes, a condemned prisoner would be dramatically pardoned mid-spectacle, his life spared to demonstrate imperial clemency. More often, however, such pardons were rescinded at the last moment to underline the emperor's authority over life and death. Domitian, notorious for his cruelty, reportedly staged mock pardons only to reverse them publicly, heightening the drama and reinforcing the lesson. Mercy was a gift, not a right. Religious symbolism ran deep through these events. Executions during festivals were framed as offerings to the gods, acts of purification that cleansed the city of its moral and political contaminants. Criminals, rebels, and traitors were not merely punished, they were sacrificed. The public nature of these rituals ensured that the community participated in the act, whether by cheering, mocking, or simply watching. This participation was itself a form of complicity, binding citizens to the violence that sustained their society. The spectacle often extended beyond the arena. After the executions, bodies might be left on display for days, nailed to crosses, impaled on stakes, or chained to gates as reminders of the state's vigilance. Processions sometimes paraded the corpses through the streets before dumping them in the Tiber or the city's refuse pits. These acts of posthumous humiliation reinforced the idea that punishment extended beyond death, that even the memory of rebellion could be erased and disgraced. For the participants, the condemned themselves, the timing of their deaths was part of their punishment. To be executed on a festival day meant that their final moments would be witnessed by thousands, their suffering absorbed into the fabric of public life. They were not individuals dying for their crimes. They were symbols sacrificed for the collective. Their agony was not their own. It was the property of the crowd, consumed alongside bread, wine, and song. Writers of the time revealed the disturbing normalcy of this practice. Martial, describing a festival under Domitian, praised the emperor's ability to turn crime into pageant and justice into entertainment. Pliny the Younger recalled a day when executions followed a morning of poetry readings, the crowd moving seamlessly from art to atrocity without pause. The juxtaposition was the point. It showed that the empire was so powerful, it could mix beauty and horror, celebration and death, without contradiction. To modern eyes, the idea of pairing executions with festivals seems almost unthinkable, a perverse celebration of cruelty. But to the Romans, it was logical, even necessary. The same gods who granted victory demanded blood. The same empire that built roads, aqueducts, and libraries ruled through terror. And the same people who cheered a triumphal procession understood that the glory they celebrated was sustained by violence. In the end, these festivals of death reveal more than just Rome's appetite for spectacle. They expose a worldview in which cruelty was not a flaw of civilization, but one of its essential functions, a public ritual that reaffirmed the empire's values and reminded its people of their place. Death was not merely a punishment, it was a holiday. And in the heart of the Roman calendar, the executioner's blade was as familiar a sight as the priest's altar or the chariot's wheel. Rome's empire was built on conquest, but its victories were not complete until they were performed. To the Romans, war was not truly over when the enemy surrendered or a treaty was signed. It was over when the conquered were humiliated before the people their leaders displayed, mocked, and executed in a spectacle that turned military triumph into civic ritual. This was how Rome celebrated its supremacy, not just by defeating its enemies, but by showing that defeat in the most public and degrading ways imaginable. The tradition of displaying and killing enemy leaders dates back to the Republic. When a victorious general returned from war, he could petition the Senate for a triumphus, a ceremonial parade through Rome, celebrating his success. At the heart of the procession marched the spoils of conquest, plundered treasure, captured banners, and most importantly, defeated kings and generals. They were paraded in chains through the streets, jeered by crowds, forced to witness the empire's wealth and power paraded before them. For many, the triumph was not the end of their humiliation, it was the prelude to their death. One of the most famous examples was Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who united the tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar in 52 BCE. After his defeat at Alesia, he was taken prisoner and held in chains for 6 years. When Caesar celebrated his triumph in 46 BCE, Vercingetorix was paraded before the Roman people, once a proud leader, now a captive spectacle. At the end of the parade, as was customary, he was taken to the Tullianum prison beneath the Capitoline Hill and strangled to death. His execution was not a military necessity. It was a performance staged for political effect, a demonstration that even the greatest enemy of Rome would die at its feet. The death of Jugurtha, king of Numidia, followed a similar script. Captured by Sulla after years of guerrilla warfare, he was dragged in chains through Rome during Marius's triumph in 104 BCE. Contemporary accounts describe Jugurtha's eyes wild with rage as the crowd mocked him, a once mighty monarch reduced to a prop in Rome's theater of victory. He was executed in the Tullianum immediately after the ceremony, his final screams echoing off the damp stone walls that had witnessed the deaths of so many of Rome's enemies. This ritual humiliation continued into the imperial era, where it took on even grander forms. Emperor Claudius staged elaborate public executions of captured British and Germanic leaders, forcing them to appear in the arena before their deaths. Tacitus records how Boudicca's daughters, captured after their mother's rebellion in Britain, were displayed as trophies of conquest, their suffering turned into entertainment. Nero paraded captured Parthian nobles through the Circus Maximus, their fine clothes stripped and replaced with chains, before ordering their executions as part of the games. These events were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were political statements, designed to remind the Roman populace that no foreign power, no matter how mighty, could defy the empire and live. The spectacle did not always end with death. Sometimes captured kings were forced to participate in staged executions of their own soldiers, compelled to watch as their armies were slaughtered before them. In one notorious event, following Trajan's campaigns in Dacia, captured nobles were forced to dig their own graves in the arena before being executed, their humiliation heightened by the presence of cheering crowds. Others were used as living props in mock battles, dressed as defeated generals or mythological villains, and killed in performances that blurred the line between justice and theater. For the Roman public, these spectacles were more than mere entertainment. They were deeply symbolic acts that reaffirmed the empire's worldview. Rome saw itself as the chosen agent of order, the bringer of Pax Romana, and the execution of foreign leaders was presented as a cosmic necessity, the subjugation of chaos by civilization. The public nature of these events ensured that this message was absorbed by every spectator. Children watched their father's enemies humiliated. Senators nodded approvingly as defiance was crushed. Slaves saw the consequences of rebellion played out in the bodies of kings. The psychological impact extended far beyond the city. News of these executions spread rapidly across the provinces, serving as a deterrent to rebellion. The fate of Vercingetorix was a lesson to future Gallic leaders. Jugurtha's death, a warning to African kings. Even powerful monarchs understood the message. Rome's wars did not end on the battlefield. They ended in the forum, the arena, or the prison cell, where powerlessness was displayed as publicly as power. Yet there was also an undercurrent of fear beneath the triumphalism. The Romans were obsessed with the idea of clementia, imperial mercy, and the execution of foreign leaders was sometimes criticized as excessive or dishonorable. Cicero argued that true greatness lay in sparing one's enemies, not destroying them. Augustus, mindful of this perception, occasionally spared defeated kings, allowing them to live under Roman supervision as client rulers, a living reminder of Roman dominance. But such mercy was the exception, not the rule. More often, blood sealed Rome's victories. Even in death, the humiliation continued. Executed kings were often denied proper burials, their bodies thrown into rivers or left for scavengers. Their names were erased from inscriptions, their dynasties dissolved, their kingdoms absorbed. The empire's message was relentless. To oppose Rome was not only to risk defeat, but to have one's memory itself annihilated. These spectacles of conquest reveal a crucial truth about Roman power. It was not enough for enemies to die. They had to be seen dying degraded, mocked, and stripped of everything they had been. Their destruction had to be witnessed and remembered, etched into the public consciousness as proof that Rome's reach was infinite and its wrath inexorable. The arena and the triumphal parade were more than stages for execution. They were stages for ideology. They told the world that even kings could be dragged in chains, that even empires could be broken, and that no power on earth could stand before the might of Rome. The fall of kings was not merely a fact. It was a performance, one that defined the very meaning of imperial rule. No Roman citizen was too young or too innocent to witness death. The arenas and circuses were not places from which children were shielded. They were classrooms, civic spaces where the next generation learned what it meant to be Roman. Public executions and bloody entertainments were woven into the fabric of family life, attended as casually as one might attend a theater play or a religious procession. Fathers brought their sons to see criminals torn apart. Mothers carried infants into the stands as gladiators fought, and condemned prisoners screamed. This was not considered strange. It was considered an essential part of how Roman society passed on its values. The imperial calendar was packed with spectacles, and attendance was expected of all citizens. Senators and plebeians alike took their families to the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, or the provincial amphitheaters that dotted the empire. Admission was often free, subsidized by the state or wealthy patrons eager to curry favor with the masses. Invitations were distributed for major events, and families would rise before dawn to secure good seats. Children were not relegated to the sidelines. They sat beside their parents, directly exposed to every detail of the spectacle unfolding below. Writers of the era describe the enthusiasm with which Roman families attended these shows. Martial, in his epigrams, boasts of young boys cheering as gladiators clashed, and animals tore into condemned criminals. Juvenal complains that crowds, including children, shouted themselves hoarse, demanding more blood, more violence, more spectacle. Even elite families brought their children to the games, believing that exposure to public punishment would instill discipline, courage, and a proper respect for authority. Watching death was not seen as traumatizing, it was seen as instructive. The morning executions were especially popular with families. These early spectacles, held before the main gladiatorial combats, offered a parade of punishments from beheadings and crucifixions to damnatio ad bestias. Children watched as criminals were tied to stakes, burned alive, or thrown to wild animals. Parents explained the crimes that led to such punishments, teaching moral lessons through spectacle. This is what happens to thieves, to traitors, to those who defy the emperor. The arena became a visual textbook of Roman law and hierarchy, one where punishment was not just spoken of, but graphically displayed. For many, the games were as much about civic identity as they were about entertainment. Roman power was built on conquest and control, and the arena reflected that power in microcosm. By exposing children to it early, parents ensured that they understood their place in the imperial system as citizens who obeyed, who cheered, and who accepted violence as a natural part of order. The state relied on this conditioning. A society raised from childhood to see public death as normal was far less likely to question the brutality that underpinned imperial rule. The games were also social events, and this communal aspect made the spectacle even more powerful. Families picnicked in the stands, shared food and wine, and discussed the day's events as casually as modern audiences might discuss a sports match. Vendors circulated selling bread, fruit, and wine. Children played games in the aisles during pauses in the action. All the while, men screamed as they were disemboweled, animals devoured the condemned, and slaves died reenacting myths. The juxtaposition was deliberate and deeply revealing. Death was not treated as a sacred or solemn event. It was a part of everyday life, seamlessly woven into the rhythms of Roman leisure. The impact of this early exposure was profound. By the time Roman boys reached adulthood, they were desensitized to suffering. Violence was no longer shocking, it was expected. Executions, floggings, and mutilations were simply tools of governance. This conditioning extended beyond the arena. Public punishments in the forum, military decimations, and even household discipline all drew from the same cultural well, a worldview in which cruelty was not a flaw of power, but one of its most effective instruments. Some contemporaries worried about the effects of this constant exposure. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, lamented the way children learned cruelty before they learned compassion. He described crowds, including the very young, laughing as men were dismembered, and mocking the condemned as they begged for mercy. But Seneca's objections were rare and largely ignored. The Roman state had no interest in curbing such spectacles. They were too effective at shaping loyal, unquestioning citizens. Occasionally, the arena even included events designed specifically for younger audiences. Some executions were staged as moral plays, where criminals portrayed mythological villains or traitors punished by the gods. These dramatized lessons, mixing violence with narrative, served as didactic tools for children, teaching obedience through story as well as spectacle. In one account, condemned men were forced to act out the punishment of Prometheus, their organs torn by birds as children watched, their teachers explaining the moral of defying divine order. The normalization of violence also extended into domestic life. Toy vendors sold miniature gladiators, wooden swords, and small-scale arena sets for children to play with. Boys reenacted battles and executions in the streets, mimicking the scenes they had seen in the Colosseum. The state encouraged this, seeing it as preparation for military service and civic duty. Even girls, though excluded from combat, grew up absorbing the same lessons about power, hierarchy, and the consequences of disobedience. Perhaps most disturbing was how easily these lessons endured. Roman citizens who grew up attending executions rarely questioned the morality of the spectacles as adults. They accepted them as part of the natural order, a necessary expression of imperial authority. Even those who pitied the condemned did so from a distance, their empathy dulled by a lifetime of exposure. The arena had done its work well. In Rome, cruelty was not taught in secret. It was taught in the open in amphitheaters and circuses, in front of cheering crowds and clapping children. It was taught not through lectures, but through blood. And in that teaching, the empire ensured its own survival. A society that learns to cheer for death does not easily rebel against the system that deals it. The family outing to the arena was not merely a day's entertainment. It was an education one that carved obedience into the hearts of generations, shaping citizens who would accept, participate in, and perpetuate the brutal machinery of empire without hesitation. In the Roman imagination, the human body was not sacred. It was a tool, a medium for punishment, a surface for messages, and at times, a laboratory for knowledge. Public spectacles were not confined to executions and combat. They also included acts of calculated mutilation, medical demonstration, and grotesque experimentation. To the Roman state, the condemned did not merely forfeit their lives, they forfeited their very humanity. Once stripped of legal protection, their bodies could be used for any purpose the empire desired, even if that purpose was curiosity masquerading as science. The practice had ancient roots. Early Roman punishments often involved physical mutilation designed to mark or degrade the guilty. Thieves might have their hands severed. False witnesses had their tongues cut out. Soldiers who deserted were branded or had limbs removed as warnings to others. These punishments were often carried out in public, their theatricality integral to their purpose. It was not enough for a man to be punished, his body had to display that punishment for the world to see. But as Rome grew into an empire, and public spectacles became more elaborate, mutilation took on new forms that blurred the line between punishment and demonstration. Condemned criminals, especially slaves and prisoners of war, were sometimes subjected to staged amputations before execution. Limbs were removed one by one, while the crowd watched, the victim suffering prolonged for dramatic effect. Occasionally, this was done as part of a symbolic ritual, the cutting off of hands to represent theft, tongues for treason, but more often, it was simply an exercise in cruelty, a spectacle designed to test the limits of human endurance. Roman writers describe executions where victims were dissected alive, their bodies cut open for the crowd's education. Seneca refers to one such event where an anatomist opened the chest of a condemned man in the arena to demonstrate the structure of the heart and lungs. Others detail scenes in which condemned men were deliberately wounded, stabbed, burned, or pierced so that physicians and spectators alike could observe how different injuries affected the body. The condemned, deprived of personhood, became instruments of spectacle and instruments of knowledge at once. These gruesome practices were not limited to the capital. In provincial cities, magistrates and doctors often collaborated in using condemned criminals for surgical experiments. Galen, one of Rome's most famous physicians, wrote of observing the exposed nerves and organs of living subjects, almost certainly condemned men to better understand anatomy and physiology. The results of such research advanced Roman medicine, but they did so at a staggering human cost. The suffering of the condemned was considered irrelevant, their bodies reduced to disposable teaching tools for science and state alike. The Romans also staged spectacles of bodily transformation that had nothing to do with medicine. Some condemned were mutilated to serve as living symbols of their crimes. Rebels might have their right arms cut off the hand that raised itself against Rome. Blasphemers could have their tongues torn out and displayed before the crowd. Traitors were sometimes blinded or castrated, their bodies permanently altered as warnings to others. These punishments were carried out publicly, often followed by execution, but the mutilation itself was the central event, the moment when punishment became visible and irreversible. Such displays were often integrated into broader public festivals. During the Saturnalia games under Domitian, criminals were tied to posts and systematically dismembered before being thrown to the beasts. Under Hadrian, a notorious spectacle in Antioch involved condemned men having their skin flayed while still alive, the executioners peeling it away to reveal muscle and bone beneath. To the Romans, such acts were not senseless sadism. They were performances of imperial power demonstrations that the state controlled not only life and death, but the very substance of the human body. There was also an element of curiosity, a perverse fascination with the body's resilience and vulnerability. Crowds marveled at how long a man could remain conscious after losing a limb, how far he could walk without a hand, how much blood flowed from a severed artery before death claimed him. These details, shouted by heralds and recorded by chroniclers, became part of the lore of the games. The condemned were no longer people. They were data points, living experiments in suffering. Some emperors took this fascination further. Nero, obsessed with anatomy and transformation, reportedly commissioned spectacles where condemned men were surgically altered limbs removed and replaced with artificial ones, wounds stitched and reopened, all to explore the boundaries between life and death. Whether these accounts are exaggerated or not, they reflect a culture that saw no contradiction between entertainment and experimentation, cruelty and curiosity. In the Roman arena, all were one and the same. The moral implications of these practices were profound, but they went largely unexamined. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny occasionally voiced discomfort, warning that such spectacles eroded the humanity of both victim and spectator. But the majority of Romans accepted them as normal, even admirable. The idea that the condemned had no rights was deeply ingrained. Once declared noxii, they ceased to be persons and became property, that the state could mutilate, dissect, or display however it wished. In a society built on hierarchy, this dehumanization was part of the system's logic. Roman citizens needed to see the difference between themselves and those who opposed the state. Public mutilation made that difference physical and undeniable. The citizen stood whole and free in the stands. The rebel or slave lay dismembered and broken below. The contrast was the lesson. To modern eyes, these spectacles of mutilation and experimentation are among the most disturbing aspects of Roman public life. They reveal a civilization not merely content with killing, but eager to explore, manipulate, and exploit the human body in death and in life. The condemned were stripped of more than dignity. They were stripped of identity, agency, and even biological integrity. Their bodies became tools for power, curiosity, and performance. And the crowds that watched cheering, laughing, learning were complicit in that transformation. The Roman arena was not reserved for men. Women enslaved, condemned, rebellious, or simply unfortunate were also dragged into the sand to suffer and die before roaring crowds. But their treatment was often different, shaped by deeply ingrained cultural views about gender, purity, and honor. For female prisoners, punishment was not only about death, it was about degradation, the stripping away of dignity, identity, and humanity, in ways that turned cruelty into performance and humiliation into entertainment. The presence of women in public executions shocked foreign visitors, but seemed natural to the Romans, who viewed the arena as a space where power could act without limit. Female prisoners were paraded naked through the streets before their execution, their exposure part of the punishment itself. The act was deliberate and symbolic, a reminder that the state controlled not only life and death, but modesty, sexuality, and the very body of the condemned. Cicero himself described such parades as necessary lessons in obedience, designed to break the will of those watching as much as those suffering. Once inside the arena, women were subjected to punishments tailored to their gender. One of the most common was stuprum publicum, forced sexual humiliation before execution. Stripped and bound, female prisoners were assaulted by slaves, soldiers, or even trained performers, their violation presented as entertainment for thousands. In many cases, this act was staged to mimic mythological scenes, Leda and the Swan, Europa and the Bull, turning cruelty into theater and sexual violence into spectacle. It was a message to the crowd. Rebellion against Rome would not only end in death, but in a degradation that erased all traces of honor. Executions involving women often followed a carefully choreographed script. Condemned wives of traitors were paraded with their children before being slaughtered. Female rebels were forced to carry symbols of their crime, a sword, a banner, a scroll, as they were led to their deaths, the objects used as props in their final humiliation. Even noble women were not spared. Boudica's daughters, captured after the Iceni rebellion, were publicly assaulted and displayed before the games. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, was paraded in chains in Augustus's triumph, a living reminder of her dynasty's fall, though her life was spared. The spectacle of female suffering was more than punishment. It was propaganda. Some of the most grotesque spectacles involved pairing women with wild animals. In Damnatio ad Bestias, female prisoners were stripped naked and tied to posts as lions, leopards, or bears were released. Writers like Cassius Dio record how the crowd's cheers rose not only at the moment of death, but during the moments before when the women screamed, wept, or prayed, their vulnerability heightening the drama. In other cases, animals were trained to violate their victims before killing them, a practice so infamous that the satirist Juvenal called the arena a brothel of blood. Not all women died quickly. Some were forced into gladiatorial combat, not against other women, but against trained fighters or wild beasts they could not possibly defeat. These gladiatrices were not competitors, but objects of ridicule, their deaths designed to amuse rather than impress. Suetonius describes a spectacle under Domitian in which women from the conquered Germanic tribes were made to fight each other with wooden swords before being slaughtered. The audience laughed, not at their skill, but at their helplessness, the absurdity of women pretending to be warriors before being reminded of their place through death. The humiliation of women also extended beyond the arena. Their bodies were often left exposed after execution, denied burial rites, their names erased from public records. In some cases, their corpses were displayed in the forum or hung from the city walls as warnings to others. These acts were meant to annihilate not just the individual, but her memory, ensuring that no martyrdom could arise from her suffering. The political uses of female suffering were particularly clear in cases involving royal or noble women. Their degradation symbolized the subjugation of entire peoples. Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, was paraded in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph, her humiliation marking the empire's dominance over the East. She was spared execution, but her fate reduced from queen to captive was a message to every client kingdom. Resistance to Rome would end not only in defeat, but in public disgrace. For the Roman audience, these spectacles were both titillation and instruction. The violation and execution of women affirmed patriarchal power as much as imperial authority. It reinforced cultural beliefs about female weakness, dependence, and inferiority beliefs that underpinned Roman law and society. To see a woman stripped, degraded, and destroyed was to see order restored, hierarchy reaffirmed, and Roman power made flesh. Yet even in death, the spectacle of female suffering left its mark on those who watched. Philosophers like Seneca and Musonius Rufus decried the corruption of public morals, warning that exposure to such scenes eroded compassion and desensitized society. But such warnings were largely ignored. The arena's cruelty was too deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life, its logic too essential to the state's display of dominance. What happened to women in the arena reveals perhaps the darkest side of Roman public spectacle. It was not enough to kill. The state sought to unmake, to strip away dignity, identity, and humanity, until nothing remained but a broken body and a cheering crowd. In a society that prized control above all else, the suffering of women was not an aberration. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, a power that reached into every aspect of life and death, that reduced even the most intimate violence to public entertainment, and that left no one, not even the innocent or the powerless, beyond its reach. In the Roman world, power was never purely political. It was sacred. Every victory, every law, every emperor's decree existed within a framework of divine order, and maintaining that order required more than prayers or offerings of wine. It required blood. Public executions were not just punishments or entertainments. They were sacrifices, rituals designed to appease the gods, cleanse the city, and demonstrate that Rome ruled not only by strength but by divine favor. In this worldview, killing was not just a civic duty. It was a sacred act. The idea that blood could sanctify the state stretched back to Rome's earliest days. The supplicium de mor maiorum, The execution, in the manner of the ancestors, was a ritualized killing performed to atone for serious crimes against the gods. Those who violated sacred oaths, committed sacrilege, or angered the divine order were not simply executed, they were offered. Their deaths were sacrifices meant to restore balance between the human and the divine. This belief permeated Roman law. Crimes like treason, per duellio, temple theft, sacrilegium, or incestuous priestly misconduct, incestum, were often punished in explicitly religious ceremonies. One of the most infamous rituals was the execution of the Vestalis, a Vestal virgin who broke her vow of chastity. These women were believed to embody Rome's spiritual well-being. Their purity was linked to the city's fate. If a Vestal was found guilty of violating her vow, she could not simply be killed. Spilling her blood directly was considered sacrilegious. Instead, she was buried alive in a subterranean chamber near the Colline Gate, given a small amount of food and water to sustain the illusion that the state had not taken her life directly. The act was brutal, but it was framed as a religious necessity. The gods had been offended, and the city's purity had to be restored. Other executions were conducted during festivals specifically designed to purify the state. The ludi seculares, held once every 110 years, included sacrifices of animals and, according to some sources, criminals to mark the renewal of the Roman people's covenant with the gods. During the Lupercalia, priests struck spectators with thongs dipped in sacrificial blood to promote fertility, a ritual that, though symbolic, was rooted in older practices involving human victims. The October horse ceremony, in which a horse was sacrificed to Mars, may have replaced an even older tradition of human sacrifice. Even as Rome claimed to have abandoned human offerings, traces of them lingered, transformed into the language of public execution. The connection between religion and execution was especially visible in the punishment of enemies of the state. Rebels, traitors, and captured kings were often executed on days sacred to Jupiter, Mars, or Apollo. Their deaths offered as signs of divine justice. During triumphal celebrations, sacrifices of bulls and sheep at the Capitoline Temple often accompanied the strangling of enemy leaders in the Tullianum below. The symbolism was unmistakable. As the gods received their offerings, so too did Rome. The deaths of men were woven into the same ritual fabric as the blood of animals. Sometimes, the religious element was explicit. The bodies of executed criminals might be thrown into the Tiber as offerings to the river gods, or displayed at crossroads to appease spirits believed to dwell there. In times of plague or famine, executions could take on a sacrificial character intended to cleanse the city of divine anger. During the Second Punic War, when Hannibal threatened Rome, 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks were buried alive in the Forum Boarium as part of an ancient propitiatory rite, a rare but telling example of human sacrifice conducted openly under the guise of religious necessity. Even the arena itself had sacred dimensions. Many games began with prayers and sacrifices, and the first blood spilled, whether from a condemned criminal or a gladiator, was believed to sanctify the event. The Munera, originally private funerary offerings, were deeply rooted in religious tradition. The shedding of human blood honored the dead and ensured their safe passage into the afterlife. Over time, as the games evolved into state-sponsored spectacles, this religious logic persisted beneath the veneer of entertainment. Every execution, every animal hunt, every staged massacre echoed the ancient belief that blood, even unwilling blood, pleased the gods. Religion also shaped the methods of execution. Crucifixion, for example, was more than a punishment. It was a public offering of agony, a visible sign of divine and imperial justice. Beheading, by contrast, was considered a more honorable death, and often reserved for Roman citizens, whose lives were still seen as sacred in the eyes of the gods. The burning of heretics and sorcerers, common in the later empire, was justified as a purification ritual, their ashes scattered to cleanse the earth of their defilement. The psychological effect of these rituals was profound. By framing executions as sacred acts, the state cloaked its violence in divine legitimacy. The crowd did not merely watch a criminal die. They witnessed the city being cleansed, order being restored, the gods being appeased. The blood spilled in the forum or the arena was not meaningless. It was part of a cosmic exchange, a transaction between Rome and the divine powers that protected it. This fusion of religion and execution also served a political purpose. It reminded the populace that the emperor was more than a man. He was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman religion, and his justice was aligned with the will of the gods. Every execution carried his imprimatur. Every drop of blood spilled affirmed his divine mandate. Resistance to imperial power was not just treason, it was sacrilege. To modern eyes, these rituals reveal a disturbing truth. The violence of Roman justice was not hidden behind legal language or bureaucratic detachment. It was exalted, sanctified, made holy. The executioner's blade and the priest's knife were two edges of the same power, both cutting in the name of order and divine will. And for the Roman people, watching a condemned man die was not just entertainment, it was a moment of collective worship, a reaffirmation that their empire stood under the gaze and with the blessing of the gods themselves. Roman justice was never only about crime and punishment. It was about control, the visible, unforgettable demonstration of who held power and what happened to those who challenged it. Public executions were the empire's most eloquent language. They spoke in blood, in screams, in the spectacle of bodies broken before tens of thousands. And the message they carried was unmistakable. Rome was supreme, the emperor's will was absolute, and disobedience, no matter how small, how private, or how justified, would always end the same way. From the earliest days of the Republic, executions had been political acts. The Senate's power to declare someone hostis an enemy of the state transformed political opponents into targets for public destruction. Catiline's conspirators were strangled without trial in 63 BCE, not simply because they plotted treason, but because their death sent a message to every senator watching: opposition would be met with annihilation. Even when executions were legal, they were staged to humiliate. Cicero famously ordered the severed hands and head of Mark Antony's ally Publius Clodius displayed on the rostra, turning a corpse into a billboard of state vengeance. The imperial era elevated this logic to a central instrument of governance. Emperors understood that the power to punish, and to do so publicly, was one of the most effective tools they possessed to shape opinion, intimidate rivals, and assert authority. Caligula, whose reign, 3741 CE, was defined by paranoia and excess, used executions to terrorize the Senate and silence dissent. He delighted in forcing senators to watch the torture of their colleagues, occasionally inviting them to dinner parties where, between courses, prisoners were beaten or executed before their eyes. It was a calculated humiliation, a reminder that their lives hung on his whim. Nero, too, mastered the art of political theater. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he blamed the fledgling Christian community and staged their executions as elaborate public shows. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and set alight to serve as human torches during nighttime festivities. The message was clear. Nero was not responsible for the disaster, and anyone who suggested otherwise would meet the same fate. It was propaganda through horror, and it worked. Fear silenced criticism, and the spectacle united the population against a convenient enemy. Even good emperors wielded public executions strategically. Augustus, often celebrated as a stabilizing force, used them to consolidate his regime after decades of civil war. The captured sons of Mark Antony and Cleopatra were paraded through Rome, their humiliation a living warning against defiance. Augustus also revived the practice of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a traitor's name from inscriptions and monuments, often pairing it with public executions, to obliterate both the person and their legacy. Execution was not just the end of life. It was the annihilation of influence, reputation, and memory. Emperors also exploited executions to shape public opinion on policy. Trajan, facing dissent over his costly Dacian campaigns, staged executions of Dacian prisoners in the arena to justify the wars. By showing their barbarity, sometimes through carefully choreographed reenactments of supposed atrocities, he framed the conflict as a moral necessity rather than imperial ambition. Similarly, Marcus Aurelius used public executions of deserters and mutineers during the Marcomannic Wars to reinforce discipline and demonstrate the price of disloyalty during crisis. Sometimes the spectacle was aimed not at enemies, but at allies. Domitian, deeply suspicious of the Senate, executed senators accused of conspiracy and displayed their bodies in the forum, forcing colleagues to step over them on their way to meetings. This was not justice, it was theater, staged to erode solidarity and ensure no one dared form alliances against him. The executions of powerful freedmen, imperial relatives, or military commanders followed a similar pattern. They were not just eliminations, they were public performances of dominance designed to instill fear in every level of society. These displays of power extended beyond the capital. In provincial cities, governors staged public executions of rebels, tax resistors, and even outspoken philosophers to reinforce Roman authority. The crucifixion of 6,000 slaves after Spartacus's rebellion in 71 BCE was not merely a punishment, it was a political statement. Their bodies, nailed along the Appian Way for miles, formed a silent, rotting warning to every slave and subject across the empire. Rebellion would end not only in death, but in disgrace and oblivion. Executions also served as political distraction. When grain shortages or military defeats threatened public unrest, emperors frequently staged large-scale executions to redirect anger and unify the populace against internal enemies. Scapegoats, Christians, foreigners, astrologers, corrupt officials were rounded up and slaughtered in the arena, their deaths reframing complex problems as matters of simple justice. The people, temporarily appeased, returned their loyalty to the emperor who had protected them. Even the timing of executions was political. They were often scheduled to coincide with major festivals, triumphal parades, or imperial birthdays moments when crowds were largest and the empire's glory was most visible. The spectacle of punishment became part of the celebration, a ritual that bound loyalty, fear, and festivity into a single public experience. The condemned were not just criminals. They were symbols, embodiments of treachery, rebellion, or moral corruption, whose destruction reaffirmed the order of the world. The deeper message of these spectacles was not subtle. Rome did not tolerate opposition. Power was not debated, it was displayed. And the blade, the cross, the beasts, and the fire were as much tools of governance as the law or the legions. The condemned were made to die publicly because their deaths were not private matters. They were political events, designed to be seen, remembered, and repeated in whispers long after the sand had been swept from the arena floor. To live under Rome was to understand this language of power. It was to know that every drop of blood spilled on public ground carried a meaning larger than the individual who shed it. Each execution was a sentence not just on the condemned, but on anyone who might follow their example. It was a message carved into the very fabric of public life. Rome does not forgive. Rome does not forget. And above all, Rome does not allow disobedience to go unanswered. By the height of the Roman Empire, executions had grown far beyond isolated punishments. They became events planned, orchestrated, and staged on a scale that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. For the emperors, mass executions were a tool to display control over life itself. For the people, they were entertainment, a grotesque form of theater that fused violence with pageantry, turning the deaths of hundreds or even thousands into an afternoon's amusement. The boundary between punishment and performance vanished entirely. What remained was blood, staged for applause. The origins of these mass spectacles can be traced back to the ludi, the public games, which, by the late Republic, had already begun incorporating executions into their schedules. At first, they were small-scale, a handful of criminals thrown to beasts in the morning before the gladiatorial contests began. But as the appetite for blood grew, so did the ambition of those who supplied it. By the time of the Flavian emperors in the 1st century CE, the state staged executions involving hundreds of condemned men and women at once, their suffering choreographed into elaborate narratives. One of the most notorious examples occurred during the inauguration of the Colosseum in 80 CE, when Emperor Titus marked the completion of the massive amphitheater with 100 days of games. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, thousands of people, criminals, prisoners of war, rebels were executed in a single day. Some were burned alive, others torn apart by animals, still others forced to fight each other to the death with no training or armor. The sheer scale of the killing was part of the message. Rome's power was limitless, its reach unchallengeable, and even death could be organized, scheduled, and consumed like entertainment. These mass executions were not chaotic. They were meticulously staged. Prisoners might be divided into groups and pitted against each other in mock battles, reenacting Rome's victories over Carthage, Gaul, or Parthia. In these games, there was no outcome but death. The victors were often executed anyway, their momentary survival serving only to extend the spectacle. Sometimes the condemned were forced into elaborate theatrical productions, reenacting historical or mythological massacres. At one such spectacle under Emperor Claudius, hundreds of prisoners were dressed as Trojans and slaughtered to commemorate the fall of Troy, a chilling fusion of legend and reality that delighted the crowd. The nomachii, or staged naval battles, were among the most extravagant forms of mass execution. Vast artificial lakes were flooded, or in the case of the Colosseum itself, the arena floor was transformed into a shallow basin, and thousands of condemned men were forced to fight to the death as fleets. The most famous nomachia took place under Emperor Claudius in 52 CE on Lake Fucine, where 19,000 men fought and died in a staged sea battle. The emperor and his court watched from a gilded pavilion as the condemned, dressed as rival navies, hacked each other apart in the water. Few survived. The point was not victory, it was slaughter as spectacle. The psychological dimension of these events was crucial. Mass executions were not only about killing enemies, they were about overwhelming the senses, immersing the public in the raw power of the state. The sheer number of victims made individual suffering invisible. Faces blurred into a mass, screams into a background noise, blood into a spectacle. The crowd did not pity the condemned, they could not. The scale was too vast, the event too stylized. What they witnessed was not murder but performance, a carefully choreographed demonstration that Rome could command death on an industrial scale. For the emperors, these spectacles were also deeply political. They served to celebrate military victories, distract from domestic crises, or commemorate imperial milestones. Domitian staged a mass execution following a failed revolt in Germania, forcing thousands of captured rebels to fight and die in the arena. Marcus Aurelius ordered a similar spectacle after the suppression of the Marcomannic Wars, executing prisoners in public to reinforce Roman dominance. Even emperors, who prided themselves on restraint, like Hadrian, could not resist the political utility of such displays. Mass death reminded the empire's subjects and its enemies that resistance was not merely futile, it was suicidal. The condemned themselves were stripped of all individuality. They were known not by name, but by number, their fates sealed long before they entered the arena. Once declared noxii, they were legally dead property of the state, to be disposed of as spectacle required. They were herded like livestock, branded and marched into the arena en masse. Some attempted to rebel, attacking their guards or killing themselves before the games began. Most did not. Bound by chains, weakened by starvation, they entered the sand resigned to their fate, knowing that even death would be denied dignity. The crowds responded to these spectacles with the same enthusiasm they brought to chariot races or gladiatorial duels. Vendors sold bread and wine. Poets composed verses celebrating the emperor's generosity. Children waved flags as prisoners were herded into the arena. The more elaborate the spectacle, the greater the applause. A successful day's entertainment was measured not in artistry or skill, but in the volume of screams and the depth of blood pooled in the sand. For the average Roman, this was not cruelty, it was culture. The state provided panem et circenses bread and circuses, and the people in turn offered their loyalty. Not everyone was blind to the horror. Seneca, disgusted by the scale of the killings, called such spectacles schools of murder. Early Christian writers condemned them as abominations, evidence of a society rotting from within. But their objections were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. As long as the empire stood, mass executions remained a central feature of Roman public life, both a celebration of power and a warning of its reach. In the end, these spectacles were more than entertainment. They were statements of ideology, choreographed declarations that the state controlled every breath, every heartbeat, every life within its grasp. Death, once a private event, became a public festival, and the bodies that littered the arena floor were not just victims, they were messages, spelled out in flesh and blood, proclaiming the same truth over and over. Rome ruled absolutely, and even death itself served its will. The Roman arena did not run on imperial will alone. Behind every spectacle, every crucifixion, every staged massacre, every mutilation was a vast and organized workforce. Executioners, handlers, carpenters, trainers, costumers, and stage managers all played their part in transforming punishment into performance. To the spectators, executions appeared spontaneous, as if justice unfolded naturally beneath the emperor's gaze. In reality, they were meticulously choreographed productions, executed by professionals who turned death into a craft and cruelty into a livelihood. At the center of this machinery stood the carnifex, the state executioner. Often slaves or freedmen themselves, these men were despised yet indispensable. They wielded the axe in public beheadings, drove the nails in crucifixions, and oversaw the mutilation of condemned bodies. Their skills were specialized and honed over years. A clean decapitation required precision and strength, while crucifixion demanded knowledge of anatomy to prolong suffering without killing too quickly. The carnifex was both artisan and instrument, his work hidden from polite society yet fundamental to its order. Executioners were not solitary figures. They worked in teams, assisted by lictors, attendants of magistrates, and lorari, whippers, who prepared prisoners for execution, stripping, binding, and sometimes torturing them beforehand. The lorari were also responsible for public floggings, their whips cutting deep into flesh to weaken the condemned before the final blow. Some carnifices specialized in particular punishments. Crucifixion squads managed the building and placement of crosses, while bestiarii beast handlers coordinated executions involving animals. These men trained lions, bears, leopards, and dogs to attack on cue, often starving them before the games to heighten their ferocity. The preparation for large-scale executions could take weeks. Prisoners had to be sorted by crime, status, and sentence. Scaffolds, crosses, and platforms were constructed. Props were built for mythological reenactments, costumes sewn for the condemned, and elaborate stage sets designed for theatrical deaths. The architecti engineers of the arena built mechanical devices that dropped prisoners through trapdoors, lifted cages from underground, or released wild animals from hidden compartments. They designed collapsing platforms, rolling chariots, and even mechanical mountains to simulate mythological landscapes. Each element was part of a carefully timed sequence, designed to surprise and thrill the audience. The staging of executions required coordination on a scale that rivaled military operations. A single day's games might involve hundreds of people behind the scenes. Custodes guarded the prisoners in underground holding cells known as the carceres. Arena slaves, often prisoners themselves, were tasked with cleaning the sand between events, dragging away corpses and replacing blood-soaked soil with fresh layers. Some even had to disguise themselves as animals or mythological creatures to heighten the theatrical effect of certain punishments. For many of these workers, their own lives depended on the success of the show. Failure to deliver a seamless spectacle could result in their punishment or execution. There was a financial dimension to this system as well. Executions were expensive. Exotic animals had to be imported from Africa and the Near East, sometimes at enormous cost. Wooden structures, scaffolds, and elaborate sets consumed significant resources. Feeding, housing, and guarding prisoners required manpower and money. Wealthy elites and politicians often sponsored executions as a form of public generosity, a demonstration of their loyalty to the emperor and their commitment to Roman values. These sponsorships, known as munera, were powerful political tools. A lavishly staged mass execution could elevate a senator's reputation as surely as a successful military campaign. The business of death extended beyond the state. Private contractors supplied animals, built equipment, and even provided condemned prisoners purchased from slave markets or captured in foreign wars. Merchants sold food, drinks, and souvenirs outside the amphitheaters. Families commissioned amulets and charms supposedly made from arena sand or fragments of execution equipment, believing they carried protective or magical properties. The spectacle of punishment did not just enforce social order, it fueled an economy. Executioners themselves often occupied an ambiguous social position. Feared for their work yet necessary to the functioning of justice, they lived on the margins of society. Many were denied burial in public cemeteries, and their families bore the stigma of their profession for generations. Yet some grew wealthy, receiving bribes to deliver swifter deaths or to spare certain prisoners from excessive torture. Others became minor celebrities, known for their skill or theatrical flair. The best carnifices were in high demand, traveling between cities to lend their expertise to major festivals and imperial events. The logistics of mass executions were staggering. During Trajan's Dacian triumph, thousands of prisoners were executed over several days, requiring careful scheduling to avoid logistical collapse. Prisoners were marched from holding cells in groups, their deaths timed to coincide with musical cues or public announcements. Each execution had to be performed in view of as many spectators as possible. Too many simultaneous deaths risked diluting the spectacle's impact. Even the disposal of bodies was part of the plan. Corpses were carted to pits outside the city or thrown into the Tiber to prevent disease and discourage relic collection. Behind the roaring crowds and imperial decrees, the Roman killing machine was an institution industrial in its efficiency, bureaucratic in its organization, and deeply human in its operation. Every nail driven into a cross, every animal released from a cage, every blade raised above a kneeling neck, was the work of dozens of unseen hands. The arena was a theater, and like any theater, it depended on actors, stagehands, and technicians to bring the show to life. Yet this machinery did more than facilitate execution, it normalized it. The more elaborate and organized the process became, the more natural the spectacle seemed. Killing was no longer a chaotic act of vengeance or justice. It was a profession, a system, a routine. The state could execute thousands not only because it had the will to do so, but because it had built the infrastructure to make it possible. And in that infrastructure lay one of the most chilling truths of the Roman world. Cruelty, once institutionalized, no longer needed justification. It became simply the way things were done. The spectacle did not end with death. In ancient Rome, the treatment of a condemned person's body was itself a continuation of punishment, an extension of power beyond the moment of execution. What happened to the dead was deliberate, strategic, and symbolic. It shaped how their memory was understood, how their crimes were remembered, and how fear was sustained long after their final breath. The corpse, stripped of humanity, became the state's last weapon, a mute but potent instrument of authority. The Roman approach to the dead reflected a fundamental belief. The body, even after death, could still be useful. It could educate, intimidate, degrade, and erase. It could also be weaponized against the living. For the condemned, death offered no guarantee of dignity. Their bodies could be denied burial, dismembered, displayed, burned, or cast into rivers, each method chosen for its psychological impact on the public. Crucifixion was perhaps the most iconic example. Victims were left hanging long after death, their bodies rotting under the sun, their faces unrecognizable. Birds pecked at their eyes, insects burrowed into open wounds, and the stench spread across the surrounding streets. The Romans knew this was more than cruelty. It was a visual sermon. Every passerby who saw a decaying corpse on a cross was reminded of Rome's reach, a reminder that even in death, the state could possess a body and deny it peace. This practice was especially common along major roads leading into cities, ensuring that travelers, merchants, and foreign envoys all witnessed the consequences of defiance. Other forms of display were even more theatrical. Decapitated heads were mounted on spikes above city gates, or placed on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, where they loomed over political gatherings. Cicero's own hands and head, severed on the orders of Mark Antony, were nailed there as a warning to anyone who might speak too freely. The symbolism was unmistakable. Words had consequences, and even the most respected voices could be silenced and humiliated. The bodies of traitors and rebels were often subjected to damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Their names were erased from inscriptions, their portraits smashed, their statues toppled. But physical destruction alone was not enough. Their bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, their remains scattered so they could never be properly buried or honored. Roman law considered burial a sacred duty, one that allowed the soul to rest in the afterlife. To deny it was to condemn the deceased to eternal unrest. In this way, the state extended punishment into eternity. For those condemned as enemies of the state, disposal itself became part of the spectacle. Bodies were dragged through the streets, spat upon and stoned by angry crowds. Some were tied to carts and paraded around the city before being dumped into the Tiber, a symbolic cleansing that carried the message. The city had purged itself of corruption. Others were fed to wild dogs or burned on public pyres, their ashes scattered so that no trace of them remained. These acts were not about practicality. They were about annihilation of body, of memory, of identity. Even the corpses of foreign kings and generals received similar treatment. After Vercingetorix was strangled in the Tullianum, his body was thrown into the sewers beneath the city. Jugurtha's corpse was dragged through the streets before being discarded without rites. The humiliation of death was extended into the humiliation of decay. Rome did not simply kill its enemies, it erased them, ensuring that they left behind no grave, no monument, no place for future resistance to gather. There were also more utilitarian uses for the dead. In some arenas, the bodies of the executed were fed to animals for later hunts, a practical solution that doubled as spectacle. Others were dissected by physicians for anatomical study, or used to train surgeons in battlefield techniques. The condemned, stripped of legal and spiritual personhood, became resources, raw material for science, spectacle, or even sport. Their humanity, once denied in life, was obliterated in death. These practices had a powerful psychological effect. They blurred the line between life and punishment, extending state control beyond the grave. People did not merely fear execution, they feared what might follow. A citizen might accept death, but the prospect of their body being defiled, displayed, or erased from history was a terror that lingered. Families of the condemned often bribed officials to recover remains, sometimes paying fortunes just for the right to bury a loved one in secret. Even emperors understood the potency of this fear. Augustus, seeking to emphasize his clemency, sometimes allowed enemies to receive proper burials, but only after public humiliation ensured that mercy itself served his image. The treatment of corpses also reinforced social hierarchies. Roman citizens, even when executed, were more likely to receive burial. Non-citizens, slaves, and enemies were not. Their bodies were tools of state messaging, discarded as trash or used as deterrents. This contrast reminded everyone watching of their place in the imperial order, a hierarchy that extended into death itself. In the provinces, corpse display was especially important. Governors lined roads with the crucified bodies of rebels, left severed heads on stakes outside city gates, and staged public burnings to demonstrate Roman dominance. These grisly sights were not merely punitive, they were communicative, broadcasting imperial authority in a language no one could misunderstand. A rotting body spoke more effectively than any proclamation. This is what Rome does to those who resist. Even centuries later, when the empire embraced Christianity and public executions began to change in character, the treatment of the dead remained central to the performance of power. Bodies were still displayed, still denied burial, still used to frighten and control. The methods evolved, but the logic did not. Death was not the end. It was a canvas upon which the state painted its final lesson. The aftermath of execution reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of Roman justice: its obsession with total domination. It was not enough to kill the body. The state had to possess it, desecrate it, erase it. The condemned were denied the dignity of death, denied the comfort of memory, denied even the anonymity of decay. In life, they were tools of spectacle. In death, they became monuments, monuments to fear, to obedience, to the reach of a power that refused to end even where life did. The Colosseum stands silent now, its arches empty, its sands long swept clean. Yet the echoes of what once unfolded there, the screams, The roars, the cries that once shook an empire still ripple through history. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were rituals, woven into the fabric of Roman life, shaping how power was seen, how justice was understood, how obedience was enforced. Every nail hammered into a cross, every body dragged through a forum, every corpse denied a grave was part of a story far larger than the condemned. It was the story of a civilization that built its glory not only on conquest and culture, but on fear. And in those arenas, humanity's darkest instincts were not hidden, they were celebrated. If exploring these forgotten truths changes how you see history, if it makes you question how far societies will go to preserve power, then stay with us. Subscribe, watch, and follow as we keep digging into the stories buried beneath empires, where silence and suffering still have much to tell.